This is a relatively old story that my dad has told me a few times over the years, and it's been on my mind again recently. I myself have never been able to witness the house. However, the description I've been given by multiple men, 20-something years after seeing it, gave me a very vivid mental image. To begin, I would like to mention that my father is a highly religious man. He's a preacher's son and does not believe in ghosts or anything paranormal in the slightest. Nothing seems to spook him either, but he still swears up and down that he felt something unnatural that scared the hell out of him, even just from mentioning the story to me on the rare occasion that he would bring it up. Back in the late 1980s, he and a few friends would regularly hike over the waterfall and creek bed behind our farm and would follow the trails up until they eventually met the frontage road off of the interstate. Well, one night they decided to take a different route to go around the backside of another farmer's land. It was mostly to see the animals because they owned emus and other large pets that weren't common in the local area. Supposedly after leaving the area and continuing into the woods at night, of all wonderful times, they managed to stumble upon something odd. It's described by all 5 men 20 years later as a Blair Witch look-alike house. It was a very, very old home, and my dad claims that just looking at it gave him this ominous feeling, but of course, they had to go inside and check it out. Inside the house was a vintage cottage-style interior that was probably built in the late 1940s, and the group was instantly met with writing and symbols in strange, seemingly Latin languages, with a few English graffiti pieces. These quoted a supposed satanic or pagan worshipping ritual, with certain pieces describing how to sacrifice a human soul to some supposedly demonic deity. My father still claims to this day that certain symbols were painted on the walls in blood, while others were clearly spray-painted. I find it easier to believe this because he also worked as a firefighter for years before this happened. He had a lot of experience with having to see human blood and dismembered bodies on the freeway after car accidents. Past a small living and kitchen area was a stairwell that was so small that their shoulders would physically brush either side of the wall as they went up. The stairs went straight, stopped at a small landing, and then turned right. As you started up, you could not see what might be standing at the top. At the top of the stairs, a door led to a large attic-style bedroom where actual chain manacles and locks hung from one of the walls. It was near a circular window at the end of the room, which was also completely covered in weird symbols and graffiti. Now more obvious and frightening, there were large dried puddles of blood that had seeped into the floors and walls. Allegedly, once they were upstairs investigating the room, they swear that they heard someone moving up the stairwell behind them quickly. They immediately looked, but there was no one there. Everyone essentially told me that it sounded almost like heels clacking on wood. Completely spooked, they rushed back down the stairs to see if someone was playing a prank on them and was hiding downstairs. They found nothing, and there were no new footprints in the dust and grime that differed from the ones they left on their way in. To keep things interesting, I met with each of the guys separately to ask them about what they remembered. I was expecting to maybe find a crack or something to prove that maybe they were exaggerating. But when I asked them, I got the same answer from each of them with no hesitation. They got the same details right down to the minute that they entered the house and the minute they left. But here's where it gets really strange. They left the house and for some unknown reason decided to try walking back from a different route. They were using a compass to approach from the east instead of the south. They did this test more than 10 times that night, walking from every possible route or direction, yet they always came out at the front entrance of the house. This happened even when the compass and common knowledge of the area showed that it was physically impossible to be at the south end of the house when they moved in a straight line from the north, east, or west. There probably is some scientific explanation for it, but I haven't found one yet. These guys knew those woods literally like the back of their hands and still do to this day. On the final time that the guys came back and found themselves standing at the front of the house, they began to feel physically ill. They were verging on feverish and finally decided that it was time to give up when one of them nearly fainted. As they turned to leave, the man who nearly fainted turned, looked up, and pointed at the circular window at the front of the house on the second story. Everyone looked and immediately saw a tall female figure hunched over standing in the window, watching them. They saw no features on her face other than two large dark-coloured eyes. Whatever it was sort of shuffled in place slightly before turning and walking away as if it were heading to the stairs at the end of the room. At the sight of the figure actually moving, they all took off running through the woods. They ended up on the side of the interstate, about 3 miles from my dad's house, where they originally started from. They eventually made it back to my dad's place, though they claimed that they felt as if someone were following them the entire way. My dad's cousin got up to get some water from the kitchen, only to announce that he swore to see the same figure standing outside of the kitchen window. That was near the edge of the woods, close to the woodshed. Thankfully, nothing ever came from the experience other than a collective state of absolute terror when the subject is brought up. They wrote off what his cousin saw as paranoia, though 5 years later they decided to return to see if the house was still standing. Miraculously, it had fallen in on itself and was nothing more than a pile of rubble, and they never went back. I always joked with my dad and would ask him what he would do if he went back and found the house standing the same way it had back then. I was trying to give him a reason to let me go and see the place for myself. However, with trespassing laws being far more prevalent in today's times, it would be nearly impossible without either getting shot or going to jail, as it was not on our property. I don't know. It always gives me the creeps thinking about it, but I never considered the story to be true until I did this little mock interview with all of the guys. And when I say that these grown men are scared to death by this story, I mean it. Seeing them get physically worked up and frightened by just telling the story really caused me to be less of a skeptic. I had a very scary experience happen to me in 2017. Since then, it has stuck with me throughout the years. I was about 16 at the time, and I am half indigenous. I was visiting my uncle on my mom's side, which is my indigenous side, at his cabin located in the woods of northwestern Maine. I was driving my grandpa up to visit them for the fall season. The cabin was rather small and could only accommodate my uncle, auntie, and grandpa, so I was told to sleep in the camper that was set back further into the woods. That evening went by as usual. My auntie made dinner, and we all laughed and shared stories, and eventually turned in for the night. I took a flashlight and started my way out to the camper. About halfway down, I shut off the flashlight and looked up to admire the night sky. It was at this point I noticed how quiet the forest had become. There were no birds or sounds of crickets or rustling leaves, just pure silence. I suddenly got this intense feeling of dread deep within my gut, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The voice in my head told me to bolt to the camper as fast as I could. For some reason, my instincts told me I didn't belong there, and something was watching me. When I made it to the camper, I slammed the door shut and double-locked it, closing the window blinds. I swear I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I laughed at myself for getting so worked up over nothing. The entire night I was restless in my sleep. I couldn't help but hear footsteps and movement all around the camper. I told myself it was just curious animals and grazing deer, but my dreams were haunted by something I couldn't see. Unfortunately, this would not be my final experience that weekend. By morning, all seemed normal. I thought about mentioning what had happened to my grandfather over breakfast, but I was worried that he would brush me off as being over-dramatic or being too used to city life. I let the odd night slide off my mind as I enjoyed the day with my family and their big shepherd Frank. Just to calm my nerves, I asked Frank to accompany me in the camper that evening to ensure I felt safe. The walk back was once again fine until I began to enter the tree line. I'm not sure if it was because I was feeling nervous as well, but Frank seemed to be on edge with his ears perked and head on a swivel. That night, he slept in the bed of the trailer with me. I felt safer with the dog there. However, I had an extremely awful dream in which, when I awoke, Frank was staring at the wall of the trailer with his hackles standing on end. When the morning hit, I packed my bags to leave in the afternoon and brought Frank out of the trailer. I led him out to the small field between the cabin and the thick woods. I was kicking his ball for him to excitedly chase, grab, and return to me. We continued this game until I kicked the ball a bit too hard, and it rolled right down to the edge of the woods. Frank raced down to grab the ball until his full sprint turned into a full stop, digging his paws into the dirt meters past where the ball had landed. He was standing stiff, fur on end, ears pinned back, and unmoving. I called for him to come, which he always responded to, but he didn't even acknowledge me. I began to walk down to where he was, calling his name a little bit louder still, with no response. I grabbed him by the collar, getting kind of worried at this point, as his eyes stared directly into the trees. I yelled his name loudly, giving him a little tug. The forest was silent. Moments later, the silence was broken by an echo of my voice yelling back. However, this echo was delayed and distorted. It sounded like me, but also not like me. I froze and looked into the dark woods, holding my breath only for another scream to come from the woods in my voice. I immediately turned and booked it back to the cabin. I came to my auntie crying and trying to tell her that there was something out there in those woods. She comforted me and told me it must have been nothing, although she seemed as if that was not the answer she wanted to give. My family is rather superstitious, especially me, and I'm guessing she didn't want me to overthink anything. I left that afternoon, and I have not been back since that weekend. I don't have any idea of what I experienced. I'm not sure if I'm dealing with a cryptid, bad spirit, or just an overactive imagination. This happened during the pandemic time. Where I live, we have had relatively few COVID cases. There were almost none at all back in the fall. Because of that, although we were still living under certain restrictions, we had more public health-sanctioned freedoms than many other places. For example, at the time, we were permitted to share our social bubble with one other household and travel within our region. My family and our fellow bubble family decided to take advantage of this by going on a fall getaway. We rented 2 side-by-side cabins in a beautiful, waterfront wooded spot and had a lovely, relaxing weekend. There were other cabins nearby, but most were not occupied, and we saw no other people, though we did hear a dog barking a few times somewhere not far off. On our final night there, my son decided to sleep in the other cabin with his bubble siblings. Around 11 p.m. he called over, asking for some forgotten thing. It was a very dark night, and there were certainly no streetlights in the deeply wooded cabin area, so I grabbed my flashlight and walked the short distance to the neighboring cabin to deliver whatever it was that he needed. On the walk back, I heard a whistle. It was a very human-sounding whistle, exactly the kind of whistle one makes to call in a dog. It sounded very close, but shining my light around, I saw nobody. I heard it again and assumed someone was whistling for the dog we'd heard earlier, so I didn't think much of it. A short time later, another call came from next door. My son couldn't settle and wanted to come back to our cabin. This time, my husband and I both walked over, collected our child and his stuff, said goodnight to our bubble family, and walked back. We heard the same whistle again several times. It seemed to be on the dirt road ahead of us, moving gradually away. My husband commented that the dog must have gotten loose, and the owner was out looking for it. Inside our cabin, we continued to hear the whistling, coming at irregular intervals of maybe 2 to 4 minutes. At first, it would be loud and seemed quite nearby. Then it would gradually grow fainter. Then stop as though the whistler had moved out of earshot. Then it would seem to circle around, coming from the other direction, getting louder as it moved past our cabin, then fading again into the distance. Then it would start all over again. Still not thinking much of it, my husband climbed into the loft to go to sleep, while I started to pack for the trip home the next day. Our son was sleeping in a little room on the main floor to the left of the front door, and the small window in his room was cracked open to let in the unseasonably warm night air. I was standing by that window, quietly gathering his scattered things, while the whistle once again drew closer. But this time, instead of fading as it passed by, the next one was very close and incredibly loud. It was as though the whistler was just outside my son's window. The blind was down, but I was sure someone was on the porch right outside. I leaped to the front door, flung it open, and threw on the porch light, ready to tell off some prankster on our doorstep. Nobody was there. I grabbed my flashlight and took a few steps out past the circle of light, then thought better of it and retreated inside. I locked up the cabin, closed and latched all the windows, and lowered all the blinds. If someone was creeping around outside our cabin, I didn't want them looking in at us from the darkness. Deciding that I did not want to leave my sleeping son downstairs by himself, I settled on the sofa with a book. The whistles continued. Between each one, I would convince myself it was just a bird or an animal, only to hear it again and be certain that it could only be a human sound. The irregularity of it, and the slight variations in pitch and tone, also told me that it wasn't something mechanical or electrical or automated. Around 1:30 a.m., my husband suddenly got up and started to get dressed. I asked him what he was doing. "I'm going out to find whoever that is and ask them why they've been whistling for hours," he said. I was horrified. My husband is a pretty big guy, and I was as curious as he was, but I also felt deep in my bones that it would not be safe for him to go outside that night. I insisted that he go back to bed, and thankfully he did. I sat vigil, listening to the intermittent whistles for at least another hour until finally I dozed off on the sofa. When I awoke, it was morning. The sun was peeking around the blinds, and the whistling had stopped. I cautiously peered outside, half expecting to see some sort of evidence of a nighttime intruder, but there was none. A little while later, we wandered next door, coffee mugs in hand, to get our friends' take on the mystery whistler. Amazingly, they had not heard a thing, despite the fact that the sound was so clearly audible in our cabin and would have passed right by them. We couldn't understand how they had not heard it. At checkout, I asked the woman at the kiosk down the road about it, but she just looked at me strangely and said she didn't know what it could have been. When I got home, I searched for audios of bird calls common to the area, and then ones not common to the area, in the hope of finding that same whistle. Nothing I found was even close, and we still don't know what we heard that night, circling for hours and stopping just outside our cabin door. I'm glad that you're here with us today. Please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy a good scare. As always, thank you for watching and see you in the next video.